Really want to start foundationally and really thinking about what authentic CRE is and how is it that we can tackle beliefs through thinking about what self through system reflection actually is. What does it mean in terms of our classrooms, our schools, and our districts, and what's our role in engaging self to system? So I'd like us to start in a context to really center young people's voice. We start framing the work that we do, but even the actual book itself by really thinking about our young people. And in this particular quote, what we want to kind of begin to highlight is one of our young people sharing with us. You can tell an educator, hey, I want you to do a unit on social justice, and I want you to talk about these different events in recent history. And there's a lot of teachers that will say, I'm not comfortable with that, because unfortunately, we don't have a lot of educators of color. And so that may be something that is very foreign to them. And so they want to stick to what they know. They're going to teach the history that they were taught when they were students. So the cycle continues. So to that end, we want to center what it is to do the work of self to system in an authentic way, but also how we can leverage the self to the system to be able to foundationally fully address and really dismantle disproportionality. So some of our objectives for today, as we move through this webinar, it's a couple of things. We want to make sure that we're going to provide a space for you to ask those questions around how do you begin to implement CRSE implementation within your educational setting, right? That's the critical part. Is part of this is engaging as a community as we offer pieces around examining the impact of disproportionality and who's impacted and who we have to name is impacted to move the lever around disproportionality. And further, we also want to be able to engage how do we connect theory to practice, specifically around culture response sustaining education through connecting ourselves to systems, right? I always oftentimes say, we state it very well, that sometimes we think we leave ourselves at home, but our whole self actually comes alongside with us in our role as educator, whatever that actually is for all of us. So we want to make sure that part of this process is that you're able to engage in some of the questions that you may have as we move through our process today. So there's a question and answer, obviously, but the chat, please engage us in the chat as well. I'm going to pass it on to Reed.
All right. And just to kind of lift up that, webinars sometimes feel like in the Zoom world, I'm used to like really being in there as much as possible with y'all. So like, please jump into the chat now that it's working. We have some content that we want to move through just to frame where this book is going, where we want it to, how we want it to support educators and folks doing this work. But we want it to be, to Dr. Netta's point, we want it to be collaborative. We're also going to leave like at least 15 minutes at the end to hopefully kind of surface anything that y'all are thinking about as we move through the content. So our entry point, right? You saw the cover of the book. I'll show it again here. For folks that already have a copy, lovely. We would love to hear like, well, how has it been interacting with your work currently? Like we want to get to that point too and continue to open the learning space as we engage these webinars. So much of our work, and I see some names that are like trusted and beloved colleagues from years and years. These folks know that so much of our work is about first interrogating and naming the gaps, interrogating and naming the systems that we know disproportionately impact particular students in our schools, particularly Black students, particularly students that have an IEP, particularly Indigenous students, right? We have a whole list of students that are not being served in the way they deserve in our schooling system in the United States. Our work situates those gaps in disproportionality, right? And that starts with this idea of what does the federal government tell us about disproportionality? That's the definition you see on this slide, which is this two-sided coin, right? So even in this, in our text, what we're first telling districts, schools, organizations to do is look deeply into who is most disproportionately impacted, right, in the schooling system. And we see that either on the overrepresentation, right, particularly of students of color in special education programs, or disciplinary outcomes, right? Students of color that are suspended or given more discipline referrals than white counterparts. And then the underrepresentation in the pieces of schooling that we name enrichment, right? The pieces that we know research tells us are the best type of teaching, right? Like where is there underrepresented representation and for whom? We know again the research and the pedagogues and folks that have been doing this work for decades, we continually see the same disproportionate impact. And we'll continue to talk about what that looked like. But this is the U.S. Department of Education definition. A lot of y'all will be like, all right, this seems very U.S. Department of Education-y. Dr. Malone will take us to a different definition that is doing more of the work that we want to really focus on and center. So we'll move there as we think about what's our entry point for dismantling disproportionality and how do we start to engage these pieces.
Thank you, Reed. So I'm going to talk through this definition, but just a little background while Dr. Hernandez and Reed lead lots of technical assistance efforts throughout the nation with adult educators. While I was at NYU with them, I was like, well, where are the young people as they, where's their voice as we navigate these trainings and understandings of disproportionality in education? And keeping youth at this very center, those who are most vulnerable and impacted the most. We brought together a group of students across the school district from all different types of schools, and we came together to really interrogate disproportionality and what it meant. And so the definition that Reed just showed to you, we looked at it and we were like, what's it missing? How can we redefine it? And they took that very seriously. We had lots of chart papers and finally reached a definition we all agreed to around what disproportionality really meant. And they wrote that disproportionality is the outcome of institutionalized racism and bias that result in discriminatory beliefs, policies, and practices which negatively affect historically marginalized groups in contrast to privileged groups. Next slide, please. And so just looking at the two definitions side by side, the one, the US Ed's Department of Definition, what's disproportionality, how they define it versus how the Youth Center for Disproportionality defined it. What do you all see as the biggest difference here? Or what are some differences in the ways that the young people defined it versus how the Department of Education is defining disproportionality? This is participatory, so I invite you. Oh, thank you, Reed, for putting the question in the chat. Does anyone want to answer that? I'll wait. Thank you. I see Vanessa Coleman has wrote about a systems focus, looking at root causes, absolutely. So no longer making the systemic part of it invisible. It's not just randomly that there's an overrepresentation of a specific group in special ed. Rather that there is systems of institutionalized racism and more that negatively affect such groups, Black students in particular. Thank you, Dr. Tisha Bakunda, naming racism and power. Hello, good to see you. That's my colleague over there. UC Santa Barbara professor. And yeah, thank you for that. So just bringing the invisible more visible through this definition. Next slide.
Go here. I don't want to miss a moment to shower Dr. Malone with praise and where the due credit of what it meant for this youth team to lead us, right, in the work, and what does it look like for Dr. Hernandez and I to take on this next kind of portion of our work through IESC, all built on so much of what we learned with this youth partnership, and folks that are in this webinar recognize that, like, if it's not centered in youth voice and experience, it's not the work, right? So we continue to uplift that, and Dr. Malone was critical in leading that effort and bringing us into that so we could learn from our young people. So I just want to shout that out and continue to build that way. And that's how we situate the work in the book. There's a whole chapter that's another webinar on youth work. The framing around that is all the ways in which we can continue to center youth voice and experience as leaders in our school system. So we're really excited about diving into that in one of the future webinars. The piece that you see on the slide around beliefs, policies, and practices, right? And sometimes we'll talk about beliefs, policies, procedures, and practices. A lot of this work has stemmed from so many folks before us, through technical assistance centers, through a lot of Eddie Fergus work, a lot of folks that have engaged in disproportionality work have really pushed this idea. If we're looking at Dispro and we're not looking at the beliefs and we're not looking at the policies and the practices, we're missing something, right? So I want to really kind of situate the BPPs in how we've moved districts systemically. It's also how we kind of outline that in the book in terms of, if you have a disproportionate outcome, for example, Black males in high school and ex-high school are suspended 3 times more likely. We break that down with our districts. We try to look at the root causes, which a colleague already named in the chat, right? And we break that down through the BPPs, right? So often we see things like uniform policies, right? This is one that I often share with our different districts, right? Uniform policies that, we're like, there's still a hats and hoodies policy, and so many schools still a hats and hoodies policy, right? That policy itself in many spaces is built and reinforced by racist ideology, right? Who can wear a hat, who can't, who wears a hoodie, who can't, what does that look like, and for whom, who does it impact? And that ideology is then reinforced by a policy that's written and codified, right? So in this school, in this district, you're not allowed to have a hood on, you're not allowed to have hats. And it is reinforced and kind of reified into this false notion of, like, you can't learn. And we recognize that it has actually nothing to do with learning. And the practice then that continues to manifest disproportionate outcome is kids getting pushed out of class, kids getting sent to the dean, getting sent to the principal's office for having a hat and a hoodie. And these aren't all kids, right? Again, research work for decades have shown that Black students in particular are many times more likely to receive disciplinary referrals that lead to suspensions, that are all reinforced by a policy that is reinforced by a belief, right? So all of us probably have an example of where these BPPs live in our districts, spaces, in our schools, in our organizations, right? And our work that we outline throughout the book is based on, we have to dive into the adaptive artwork that is reinforcing these codified pieces that live in school policy and then are enacted on by teachers that are like, that's what we do here, right? That's what I've been trained to do, right? So I want us to keep thinking about BPPs and the causes, solutions, and kind of as we engage our self to system approach, that's often what we're saying. So what is enacted by self that then becomes institutionalized, right? And all the individuals that end up reinforcing the institutional practice.
So in order to do the self to system work, we oftentimes say that we actually have to set the table around how different educators, communities will engage together in what are very much difficult conversations that at the forefront do center racism, white supremacy, power, and privilege. to the extent that not setting the table is what creates the conditions around fragility in spaces and not really moving the work forward because many will initially react rather than be responsive and do the self work that is necessary to get to the self, to the system. In particularly, when we know who's mostly impacted by disproportionality. So part of this, oftentimes for us, is always entailed that's laid out in our chapter of self to system is really laying the foundation around how will we get engaged together as a community? What are we actually saying will be our norms as a community? And then what are we going to commit to together as a community? And so part of that is having very clear parameters that lay out how we will struggle together, how we will participate and remain engaged, in that how we will push our growing edge, but also thinking about that the work will be one that where discomfort will happen, and alongside that, how we create a community of confidentiality. And for us, what that translates into is when communities are sharing personal information, the criticalness of ensuring that that information stays in the community space. But the content obviously gets spread. And the most important part oftentimes of our engagement is to understand our intent versus our impact. Oftentimes, we highlight that when we are in community spaces, educators are well intended, but it's beyond that. What's the impact, right? Who's impacted as a result of not fully understanding self and positionality connected to self? Another part of setting the table also includes being able to fundamentally lay out the many tensions that um, many community spaces will experience based on individual social identity markers that could include race, ethnicity, ability, gender, sexuality, nationality, language, and the intersecting identities, because it's really questions around having personal tensions, structural tensions, and strategy tensions, right? So what oftentimes is important to be able to move through is understanding personally, am I actually ready as an educator or practitioner to engage conversations around race and racism at person as a professional, but also on a personal level, right? But it's also the structural tensions that come to light that oftentimes sound, how can I, one person, actually do something about racial inequities that happen within my setting, within my school? If the school did something, if the district did something, then I would be able to do something. And then the next actual tension sits with the strategy, which I oftentimes say will sit with, I promise you, if you give me the strategy, I will implement it as intended. The reality is that without addressing the personal part around understanding the tension that it's a racialized disproportionality, and not leaning into that, right, actually does not create the conditions around how we can move through the structural tensions or the strategy tensions. So it is a lens, but it's also how will it impede from one moving forward, but how will it allow one to move forward, right? So navigating the tensions, but the importance of setting the table through the tensions becomes critical. Alongside that, right, part of this work means that we have to name who's mostly impacted. And for some, just doing that, right, creates a big tension, right? Hey, Dr. Polson, I see you. Um, Dr. Polson and I have a long-standing, like, I just like to highlight Dr. Polson, dope, doing the CRSE work in his school, has been doing it for a while. So I appreciate you, Dr. Polson. Without actually being able to name who's impacted, and actually be able to address who's impacted, we perpetuate disproportionality, right? And what that translates into, we know historically and to date, it is our children of color, specifically our Black, Indigenous, and Latinx children, our boys of color, our Black girls are impacted by disproportionality, our children who come from lower socioeconomic contexts, our LGBTQIA students, our gender nonconforming students, our children who have an IEP, and our families and communities of color, and recognizing, right, that there is clear intersections, but the failure to not actually talk about who's mostly impacted, right, is what actually allows and permits for the ongoing harm, but the ongoing disproportionality of children. And the ways that we couch this, right, is oftentimes communities who are furthest on the margins, our children are furthest on the margins, are othered, right? And that language oftentimes sounds like those children, right? So it's also being able to name that. And at what point, right, do we actually address when children who are historically and currently marginalized and are further existing from the margins are being other, because without setting those parameters, we continue to actually impact our same children.
You know, and I'll just name two in our work. So we work across multiracial, multi-ethnic spaces across the state and across the country. A lot of our work is in spaces that are predominantly white, right? I mean, we recognize what does it look like to engage teaching forces 80% white across the country, but we're also in spaces in Western, upstate, you know, rural, suburban, and the level of white mental gymnastics to not actually name who is most impacted continues to be such a learning lift, right? And this is me, a cisgendered white guy, talking about, right, like, what does it look like to your zone of proximal development is so far and deep below the ocean floor that the work is like, no, who are you speaking about, right? And educators across the board like continue this list when we bring it to trainings. They're like, what about this person? What about this group? What about this group? And all of these quote unquote groups that are named outside of this list have some racialized impact if you look at the research, right? So oftentimes it's like, can we put refugees and immigrant families there? Can we do this? Can we do that? All of that is real, right? And community context is real. And yet we continue to miss the point of what is the racialized impact in so many of these intersections, right? We can be race conscious and intersectional, right? And that's what we continue to see in district spaces as a huge gap, right? Folks want to be intersectional so they don't have to talk about race. Folks want to talk about gender so they don't have to talk about race. Folks want to talk about LGBTQIA status so they don't have to talk about race. We can do both and we have to do both, right? So just we lean here and to Dr. Hernandez's point, over and over, every training, over and over. And what does that look like to do that adaptive work internally?
Snaps to that. Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. Thank you, Reed. Reed, you really are like this, the premier white man. Am I allowed to say that? Can I say that? You are
No.
holding your I've seen him hold you know, his folks accountable to that when they avoid, you know, dodging different things. So I appreciate that. So we want to move now to cultural responsiveness and bringing the self to system, thinking about how culturally responsive sustaining education fits into this. And we first want to emphasize that culturally responsive education, sustaining pedagogies, that is the plate, that is what this is all grounded on. It is not something that's added on. It's not the little egg there or the cheese or the salt. It literally is the plate. It's everything. We start there. That's where we start. Next slide, please. But before we get into some definitions of what culturally responsive education is, or culturally sustaining pedagogies, we want to have a brief discussion. We talk about in the book around where critical race theory lives here. Like, why do we talk about it? Critical race theory has been seen as the boogeyman here, and you know, Dr. Tichapakunda, who's here, he talks about CRT a lot. In these contexts, and how it really is just sort of this politicized notion and no one really knows what it is. But we talk about what it really is, and how it comes from legal studies. And it really just gives us a lens to understand power, how race and different inequities play out, how they're systematic, how race is sort of permanent endemic within these systems. And so this chart comes from, I want to say it's Gloria Lansing Billings' 1998 piece, but in 1995, Gloria Lansing Billings and William Tate, they bring critical race theory to education. And then in this piece, she talks about what is critical race theory doing in a nice field like education. And she talks about how systems of power play out, how racism is playing out in education, how it's playing out in curriculum and instruction and funding in all different kinds of ways. And so there's two slides here, but these first two, this table here talks about curriculum and instruction. So for example, through a CRT lens, if you were looking at curriculum, you would see a culturally specific artifact designed to maintain a white supremacist master script. What does that mean? That sounds really strong. But if we think about our education today, and especially how like history is taught, for example, just that the civil rights movement, that Rosa Parks was simply just a tired Black woman who wanted to get home instead of this organized effort to challenge white supremacy. Those are the things that are messaged through us that are coming from this sort of white supremacist master script. Same with ways of instruction. So, I mean, if you'd like, I would invite you to write in the chat, how do you see these facets of schooling playing out in your educational context as well? So we can also go to the next slide because there are a few more examples. So assessment is big, and thank you, Reed, for putting the question in the chat. Feel free to answer. Low expectations, absolutely. So we hold assessments, these standards-based, these high stakes testing that really stem from eugenics. And we place all the value on that. So that's another way to look at assessment through a CRT lens. I've talked about school funding and how predominantly white areas often have more money. And if we look at outside of the schools to the different neighborhoods and how much white flight happens, our gentrification, our push out of certain groups, that also impacts schooling as well. One example, I don't remember if you all saw this viral video of Carmel High School that just showed this elaborate wealth, like these huge libraries, gyms. It looked like a university. And if you think about that, that's not what all students are experiencing. Black and brown students are experiencing, low-income students are experiencing. So are there other ways that you see how race and racism lives in different facets of schooling? And I invite you to share with us at this time, if you please. I know we have a lot of experts here, people who are deeply invested in educational equity. Thank you, Stephen. Codes of conduct. Right, and that's something what Reed was talking about earlier, different ways that we kind of criminalize students for wearing a hat. It has nothing to do with learning or the safety of anyone. Anything else? Well, we can move on, but if things come up, feel free to write it in the chat. Yes, student handbooks, library materials, and a lot of race evasive type of language. I was reading this article on school safety and defining it for Black students. And a lot of us don't think about school safety in ways where it's like, okay, don't bring knives and don't vandalize, don't bully each other. But if you're a Black student and you're in a classroom and they're talking about Black history in ways that are from a deficit perspective, or you are trying to simulate like cotton picking, which these things have happened, that's a type of violence, that's a type of way that students feel unsafe. Even not even mentioning your history at all is a way that's unsafe, that schools just don't talk about at all. Absolutely, surveillance systems, security, when I was working with these same students in New York City, a lot of them talked about, what do you call them? The metal detectors that they had to go through. It's like going to jail or something. Okay, so this brings us to what is culturally relevant pedagogy? What is culturally sustaining pedagogy? So what is the CRSE, culturally responsive sustaining education? And we have to go back to Gloria Lansing Billings because she's the one that she's sort of the mother of culturally relevant pedagogy. Her book, Dream Keepers, that she wrote in the 90s was about her research around Black students. And at that time, she was just seeing research around what's wrong with Black students, like why are they not doing well? And instead, she flipped the question. She asked a different question. She said, what works for Black students? Who are the teachers that are doing things that actually are helping Black students bring out their genius? How do we approach Black students from an asset-based perspective? And she talks about the 3 tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy that students must experience: academic success, but really she means like student learning. She's not really talking about like putting all of that in high stakes testing to prove that they are academically successful. That students also develop and maintain cultural competence. And lastly, which gets left out a lot, is that students must develop a critical consciousness through which they challenge the status quo of the current social order. So there is this examination of power and challenging that and disrupting systems. And because so many people misuse culturally relevant pedagogy and still do sometimes, like they will do the kind of heroes and holidays type of curriculum that really doesn't dive deep into, systems of power. You can tell students to bring their favorite dish from their household, but that's great too. But also, how do we understand how systems are working to privilege certain groups over others? How does white supremacy work? So Django Paris comes up with culturally sustaining pedagogies, a change in stance and terminology, and a piece he wrote in 2012, and that sort of takes off as to how do we not just use culturally relevant pedagogy to bridge towards Eurocentric curriculum. For example, that's great that you're using hip hop pedagogy, but if you're still using that just to learn Shakespeare, then that's not the point. How do we actually use education that's going to sustain people's backgrounds, communities, these cultural knowledges that they possess, linguistic knowledges, and the full range of their kind of learning and linguistic repertoire. So he talks about CSP, and he has he defines it in these different tenets around critical centering of dynamic communities and their language practices and knowledges, thinking around student and intergenerational community agency, as well as working to be in good relationship with the land. That's something big around thinking around land and indigenous communities and what it means to have reciprocal relationships with land, nature, and honestly be anti-capitalist in those ways. And structured opportunities to contend with internalized oppressions, false choices, and inward gazing. So being able to look at yourself and how you're navigating the world with your positionality. And yes, funds of knowledge, that's the Gonzalez, Amonte, Luis Moll's work, and it's very much embedded in this camp as well, thinking around how students are learning at home and using that to leverage it in the classroom. So thank you, Stephen, for bringing that up. Okay, I think I'm all done here. Reed, you're muted.
I'm glad I worked so much with my hand gesture because then you knew that I was trying to say something. Appreciate you, Dr. Malone. As we tackled this piece in the book, right, this idea of self-to-system, this idea of like working through beliefs, what we're trying to do, right, is get educators to that deeper understanding of the framework around CRSE, the pieces that Django Paris and Lansing Billings and Geneva Gay have outlined for us, right? The reality of teaching across the board is we know there's a huge gap between, like, we're talking about, what does it look like to sustain? What does it look like to understand systems of oppression? And then we're engaging teachers that are like, I see everybody the same, right? So like when we know that is what we're working with, our entry point is really trying to engage a theory of change that's moving from awareness to understanding to practices to sustained behaviors, right? So our team for several years at this point has tried to refine what does it look like to actually try to get to the point of sustained culturally responsive behaviors, knowing where so many of our educators are coming in, right? Knowing the lack of training so many certification programs are giving or aren't giving, right? Knowing that 80% again are white folks, that we recognize what self-segregation looks like. We recognize what default white normative culture looks like. It means that there's a huge leap to get to those spaces, right? So we highlight those, and you can see it on the slide, so I won't read it all the way out loud. But as we move, it's a continual kind of engagement in self. We shout out Dr. Celia Ruiz's work around archaeology of self in that chapter as well. There's similar frameworks that I'm sure y'all have seen and engaged yourself, that recognize it has to start with critical self-reflection, that kind of then leads into institutional practices, right? And we've seen this in schools, and we've been in this game long enough to see data that shows schools that are doing it to get to practices that then become sustained. Districts, that's another question, right? There's like this, like, how do you get it to be a district-based sustained behavior? But our theory of change is based here. We find our curriculum that we outline in this book, right? Both in root cause, like our equity audit curriculum, and in our culturally responsive training. All of our kind of modules are built on moving folks through this theory of change, right? Trying to get to this idea of like, culture responsive education is a way of being. Culture responsive pedagogy is a lens, right, that you're moving through the world with. And that requires continual deep self-reflection and engaging systems at the same time. So we highlight that, and we break that down a bit more in the book. And then how do you get there on the awareness end, right? And again, this can be very contextual in terms of the demographics of the district or the school that we're working with. But we have a couple very key and integral exercises and learning processes that we move teams through, right? Again, I bet y'all have something that's similar. I would love to hear, like, if there's things that you're pulling that kind of have a similar building block of like bringing awareness to understanding, because this is where we then situate that first step. One of our first pieces that we engage groups around is this idea of just defining terms, right? How do we have a deeper dialogue if we don't have shared language? And more deeper than the shared language is, how are we starting that critical self-reflection muscle? Like, how are we building racial stamina? Or to Dr. Celia Ruiz's point, racial literacy, right? Where folks that are coming in without any, right? So we know that we need to engage that. And again, like across racial identity, ethnic identity, depending on the teachers and educators, the district leaders in the room, that shifts, but there's still this grappling as a community of doing this. That's why, to Dr. Hernandez's point around the setting the table, what the contract, the tensions, that as a framework to then dive into this work. So we outline these exercises in the book and give all kind of the templates to move through it. The whole point of like dismantling disproportionality in practice, the second book, as opposed to like the first, which was mostly case studies. The whole point here is, please take it, run with it, and do it in a responsible way, right? So our kind of lift was, how do we talk about this in enough depth for folks to see that? So I'll just show you, shout out to Zaretta Hammond's work, right? Very tangible next steps to recognize, again, we're talking about like research that we know is true, in fact, of how the brain works, right? Diving into the writing and reflection, diving into the practice of growing that lens that is CRSE. We've added some questions to what Zaretta Hammond offers in the book that you see, that a lot of us know, but it's the same practice, right? How do we dive in here? This is something that we push participants off and say, talk to your mom, talk to your uncle, talk to your grandma, ask these questions and engage them. Start that process of uncovering what you thought you didn't know or what you never named, right? So that's another key piece that we outline in terms of the awareness to understanding building. Again, as we deeply believe to have culture responsive, equity driven environments, we have to be race conscious. We have to dive deep into the impact of race and racism. So we engage this idea of memories of race, which I'm sure a lot of us have done in different ways in white spaces, right? For us, for white folks, it's like, I'm going to tell you my first memory, and it's actually had nothing to do with me. And that's where we're like, nope, we are racialized as well, right? When was the first memory of you being white, right? Which is, again, like looking at these building blocks to awareness and understanding your own identity impact. This activity really kind of breaks that down and then pushes it. It requires a level of facilitation, right? The way we laid out the book, we kind of give a lot of facilitative points, like remember this or try this, or when you move through this, don't forget this piece. So really trying to offer that as a practice push. And then lastly, shout out to the University of Michigan, my alma mater, where the intergroup dialogue started. Ooh, buddy. At that point of being old and having kids where I'm like, numbers are just not adding up. But I probably did this first 22 years ago, a similar identity profile, right? Again, it's shifted over the years, but it's another level of on the top bar, you see these questions that are, again, probing questions about, for example, what gives you power and privilege in society, and starting that reflection, engaging others in dialogue in our group to then recognize how do these pieces build into the ways in which we impact students of difference, primarily in our schools, right? How do these reinforce our normative culture that we're asking other students to assimilate to, right? And particularly for us, as we see anti-Blackness in schools, what does that look like to push white normative culture that has never been interrogated, right? And has continued to be reified. So this is a great activity. And again, we offer a lot of facilitative pushes on how to make it worthwhile, and how to move through that with different groups in schools.
So part of the process is really thinking about how do you really start moving through the self-work that is necessary to then move into the fundamental beliefs that get brought into the system, that create the conditions for disproportionality, but to actually shift the system. Without doing that work, it is really hard to really shift systems because, to Reed's point, with many of our white educators predominantly being white and perpetuating systems of whiteness, the notion around where students who are not white fit into that formula creates the conditions around how racialized disproportionality happens. So that means that the fundamental work around naming, but having to do this personal work means to really step into being able to authorize oneself continue to engage and to lead the work, right? We often find that there are many educators who might go to science of reading training, and immediately once they return to school, they're ready to say, I'm ready to implement. But when it comes to the lift of being culture responsive sustaining that requires this level of deeper work, oftentimes it's the many questions around, well, where do I start? How do I do it? But part of that is really being clear around why does this matter to you and the community you're part of, right? The notion around having a personal and moral imperative. We've been in spaces where we've had educators have good intentions, well, very tasky in nature, but until they begin to kind of really make the connection around why does this matter to me? Why does it matter that we know that we're harming Black children? Why does it matter that we're excluding Black children? Then the actual wheels begin to turn without connecting it to a personal moral imperative around why this work matters. We're still on checking off boxes. And that's why the connection between authorizing self to moral imperative become critical as moving the work, but also the necessary time to message the significance of the work. The many times where we've been in many district spaces where the reason that the work doesn't move is because it's not being messaged around why it matters. Um, and we saw this very clearly when we saw the murder of George Floyd, that every district was interested in now leaning into equity work. And then what happened a few years later? The idea of actually leaning into any kind of equity work kind of began to dissipate, right? Mainly because there was no clear personal or moral imperative why this critical work mattered, specifically underscoring, right, that the data still was telling the same story, who was impacted and who's not listened to, right? So these are some of the critical parameters for us to really think about: the authorizing of self, the creating a moral imperative, the really time around messaging, but also looking at who's impacted and hearing voices from who's mostly impacted. As we get to the closure of the webinar, we want to make sure that there's a few things that, and there's many to actually thank and appreciate at the core around how we've gone here. One, Dr. Eddie Fergus actually started us to push a little bit more around disproportionality. At this point, more than almost 2 decades ago. And so a lot of the work that we've been able to do and move with has been because of the many ways that Dr. Fergus has been a leader in this work. Alongside that, our former executive director, Dr. Pedro Noguera, who's also been prime around thinking about what's the lever that we have to push around educational equity. And then we had some amazing chapter readers that, we got to give Dr. Vanessa Coleman, who did some reading and then gave some critical feedback, one of our teachers in one of our districts, but also one of our amazing educators, Dr. Hemhill, who just offered a critical lens around what's going to work in terms of an application, right? Because without our educators who are directly in the ground, we can't actually offer a context around how this will land in terms of the work, but also to offer an application book around how do I do this work now, right? And it's really our families and students who this work is for, that we commit ourselves and recommit ourselves every time when we walk into hostile spaces, nonetheless, that we show up, right? We show up and we continue to show up for students and families who are critical to the work, but who've been doing the work and have been pushing for this work, right? And our everyday educators who do this work every day, who step into being brave rather than safe on behalf of our children. And we also want to shout you out for stepping in today with us to share space with us. And of course, our amazing Director of Communications, Farrell, who always has so much to offer in terms of what he does to facilitate a lot of our webinars. At this point, what we want to do is be able to offer a space of questions that you may actually have around what you're doing, but also any questions that would be important for us to address. And alongside that, what I also say for our community members who have joined us today, right, to be in space together, we will also be offering 2 technical assistance sessions, right, office hours, for you to come to ask us questions around, depending upon where you are in this trajectory. What can I do this? How can I do this? So on and so forth. Because I think as we move forward, right, we want to make sure that part of our work really means that it's just not a training moment. It is a commitment, but it's also around how it becomes part of a system, how it becomes part of a day-to-day practice. So we'd love to kind of hear questions you have, comments you want to share in the space today.
So I'm seeing a hand raised. Let's see. Um, I don't know if we can, we got two hands raised. Are we able to actually get audio on here, or can you just drop your question? I think it's just if you drop your question in the chat. Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. And then Dia, thank you for that question. Dr. Hernandez, do you wanna take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for your question. Um, I would actually, I'm going to provide two contexts for it, right? That is, the third chapter has an actual readiness tool. And I start there, right, to kind of shape what does this look like in terms of how does how long it usually takes, right? So what we aim to do with that actual district level assessment tool is to kind of see where a district is, to kind of determine where we move with that district at large, because it gives us a lens around what that looks like over time. And so to that end, we've actually been in districts that it has been about 5 years of continuous work that have actually resulted in really reducing their disproportionality. And two, it's also been a very clear commitment. Without the ongoing commitment to say that this is the work that we're going to do as a district, it falls into the next flavor of the month continuum, right? And so the stress that we oftentimes have in district spaces is what are you committing to? And it's really involved over time. Districts making a commitment that everybody in a district is actually going to train individuals around CRSE, but also create the conditions around leads, right? In our many district spaces, what we have now is a the trainer model that has created now individuals who lead the work in that space. So they're separate from us, right? So now you have a different level of commitment. So we've seen a 5 year, right? And we've also seen an 8 year trajectory as well. And what I'll also say, it's contingent on the size of that district as well. When we've had smaller districts, and depending upon who's in the space, right, we could potentially see different shifts that are happening. Um, and I think your question is also an important question, right? Because what we haven't grappled with, even with that question, right? How do we actually measure it, right? Are we measuring it based on more of actual quantitative data that says the shifts in disproportionality have shifted? To, are we also basing it on academic outcomes, or are we basing it on how it is that students who are most harmed in school settings are actually experiencing schooling now? And their parents and caregivers, right? And that there's been practices that have been shifted, that there's been policies that have been shifted, that over time we can actually begin to see the impact on outcomes themselves.
Appreciate the comment, Elizabeth and Audrey. Thanks for naming that, yeah, and bringing and lifting that up again. What does that mean for what our white educators to engage that and interrogate the impact of that? Any other questions that y'all have that you want to drop in the chat?
Hi, Audrey. Audrey's just incredible. I just need to say hi. All right. Read.
Yeah, just again, appreciations, and I'll let Dr. Hernandez close us out. But I just wanted to say appreciate you all for being here. It's hard for us to see the impact of some of the work, or even to come out above ground and be like, let's build community, and that's so important in this work. So whether it's like a question that y'all have, or to Dr. Hernandez's point about some TA sessions we are going to offer some time, please let's work together and support. And we really hope that this becomes a resource for people to take and build and move with.
Can I also just emphasize before Dr. Hernandez closes out, just how grateful I am to be in community with everybody here who joined in, and that you all are doing such amazing work. I mean, so many of you are doing this day in and day out, and it definitely doesn't go unnoticed. And I hope that you all take advantage of the additional sessions so that we can continue to build and be in community with one another.
Yes, I'll also have a similar sentiment. Appreciate you all for coming today and stepping in and just being in community with us, and your commitment to really doing something better and more for our children and families. We look forward to seeing you on December the 5th for the next webinar that will be more concrete around what does it like to take a critical lens around or root cause analysis. What does that look like? What are the critical points around doing that? And then on January the 22nd, when we really talk about how do we make sure that our young people are central to this work? How do we build youth work, and not that moment around, oh, student council work, but authentically make sure that our young people are the central voices that we listen to, that they are part of actually our schooling, that we're making decisions every time based on the voices of our young people. And then the last piece that Pharaoh put, the last slide, we will host another equity conference on May the 30th, 2025. We are seeking proposals for submission for our conference. And two, this year's focus is Equity Now, Welcoming, Affirming, and Healing Schools. So